Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready to tackle another super relevant topic for those UPSC exams.
Always ready. What are we diving into today?
Today, it's all about ethanol blending in India. We'll be using this in-depth article from Business Standard to break it all down.
Ethanol blending. Definitely a hot topic for the UPSC. You could see questions on this in both the prelims and the mains exams, for sure.
Exactly. So if you want to ace those exams, pay close attention. We're going to cover what ethanol blending is, why India is making it a priority, and what it all means for the country's future.
Sounds like a plan. Let's dive in.
Okay, first things first. For anyone who's new to this, can you give us a quick breakdown of what ethanol blending actually is?
Sure thing. Ethanol blending is basically just mixing ethanol with petrol.
Okay, and ethanol is?
Ethanol is a biofuel, which means it's made from plants.
So like plant-based fuel. Got it.
Yeah.
And why are we mixing it with petrol?
The goal is to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and make transportation a bit cleaner. India actually launched the Ethanol Blended Petrol Program, or EBP program, way back in 2003 to start moving in this direction.
Oh, wow. So it's been around for a while. So why is India suddenly betting big on ethanol now? This Business Standard article is all about pushing for 20% blending by, what was it, 2025? What's driving that?
Well, there are a bunch of factors at play here. A big one, and the article really highlights this, is India's dependence on crude oil imports. We import over 87% of our crude oil.
Which makes us pretty vulnerable to global price shocks.
Exactly. Remember those crazy high petrol prices not too long ago?
Ugh, yeah. Not fun.
Well, ethanol can help us buffer against those kinds of price swings. The article actually mentioned that the EBP program has saved India a ton of money on those crude oil imports.
I think I saw that. Like a massive amount of money saved.
Huge. Since 2014, we've saved over 1.1 trillion in foreign exchange and replaced 181 lakh metric tons of crude oil. That's a huge step towards energy security.
Wow. So it's an economic win for sure. But the article also framed this as a win for the environment, right? How so?
Yeah, so ethanol burns cleaner than petrol. So using more ethanol means fewer greenhouse gas emissions. The article specifically mentions a reduction of 544 lakh metric tons of CO2 emissions since 2014.
So less pollution overall. That definitely aligns with India's commitment to tackling climate change.
For sure. It's a big part of our efforts to achieve the net zero target by 2070.
Okay, so we've got energy security, environmental benefits. Anything else?
Oh yeah, there's more. Ethanol production also provides a boost to the economy, especially in rural areas.
Ah, right. Because we're using crops to produce the ethanol, right?
Yep. So it creates jobs in the distilleries and gives farmers another source of income.
The article even had some numbers on that. Pretty impressive, I think.
Yeah, they were. Since 2014, ethanol blending has put 87,558 crore in the pockets of farmers and a massive 1,045,930 crore into distilleries.
Wow. So we're not just talking about a few extra rupees here and there. This is significant income generation.
Definitely. And as India starts to diversify its feedstock beyond just sugarcane to include things like maize and sorghum, even damaged food grains, it'll open up even more income streams for farmers. And it also helps promote more sustainable agriculture overall.
That's really interesting, this diversification of feedstock. Does the article go into that in more detail?
It does. It talks about how the Food Corporation of India, the FCI, is using surplus rice and maize for ethanol production.
Ah, smart. So it's like hitting two birds with one stone, managing those surplus grain stocks and creating more ethanol.
Exactly. And it generates revenue, too. The article even broke down the cost of ethanol production from different sources. Like ethanol from maize costs about 51.55 per liter, while ethanol from FCI rice comes in at around 56.87 per liter.
Okay, so a lot of positives to highlight so far. Reduce reliance on those fossil fuels, lower emissions, and clear economic benefits, especially for rural communities. But, I mean, nothing's ever perfect, right? I'm guessing there are some downsides, too.
Yeah, you're right. There are definitely some challenges that come along with ethanol blending, especially when we're talking about reaching that 20% blending target. These challenges are something any UPSC aspirant should be aware of.
All right, then, let's get into it. What's the first hurdle we need to talk about?
Well, one of the biggest concerns, especially when we talk about sustainability, is how water-intensive sugarcane-based ethanol production is.
Ah, right. Sugarcane needs a lot of water to grow.
It does, and India already faces water stress in many areas. So expanding sugarcane cultivation for ethanol could make that problem even worse, especially in those water-stressed regions. And the article actually cites a statistic from NEET-A Ayog. It's kind of alarming, to be honest. Sugarcane and paddy together use up a massive 70% of India's irrigation water.
Wow, 70%. That's huge. So, yeah, if we just keep expanding sugarcane cultivation for ethanol, we could be heading for some serious water scarcity problems.
Absolutely, especially in those regions that are already struggling with water.
Okay, so what can be done about that? I mean, the article talked about diversifying feedstock, but is that enough to really tackle these water concerns?
It's a good starting point. But yeah, we need to do more.
Like what?
Well, the article highlights the need to promote more water efficient crops, like you mentioned, maize and sorghum. But we also need to think beyond just crop choice. We need to get more farmers to use efficient irrigation techniques.
Right, like drip irrigation.
Exactly. And we also have to make sure we're minimizing water waste during the ethanol production process itself. The article talked about incentivizing distilleries to adopt zero liquid discharge systems, reduce that water footprint as much as possible.
Okay, makes sense. And this is all super important for anyone prepping for the UPSC mains, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. These are all potential points you could bring up in your answers.
Right, good to know. So we've got the water issue. But I also remember the article mentioning concerns about food security. What's the deal with that?
Right, yeah. This is where that food versus fuel debate comes in. It's a big one. And it's something that could definitely come up in your UPSC exam.
Yeah, for sure. So what's the concern exactly?
Well, when we divert food grains, things like rice and maize, towards making ethanol, it raises concerns about what that might do to food prices and whether there will be enough food available for everyone.
Yeah, especially for those more vulnerable populations. That's a valid concern. Did the article mention anything specific about that? Any data or anything?
Yeah, they actually cited a report from the Food and Agriculture Organization. It came out in 2023, I believe, and it basically warned about the potential impact of expanding biofuel production on global food supplies.
Interesting. So it's not just an India-specific issue. It's a global one.
Yeah. It's important to consider that wider context, when you're thinking about India's ethanol blending program. And something to think about for your mains exam, you might be asked to analyze those ethical implications. Like, what does it mean to divert food crops towards fuel?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a complex issue for sure.
Yeah.
And one that requires a good understanding of global food markets and the potential consequences for food security. Okay, so we've talked about water, we've talked about food security. What other challenges did the article highlight?
Well, this one's more on the practical side, but India really needs to give its infrastructure a major boost if it wants to support this increase in ethanol production and distribution.
Ah, right. We're going to need more of everything, right? More distilleries, more transportation.
Exactly. We need more distilleries to produce the ethanol, and then a really solid transportation network to get it where it needs to go. And of course, we can't forget storage facilities.
Right. Got to have somewhere to keep it.
Yep. It's a big logistical challenge, one that requires serious investment and planning.
So it's not just about making enough ethanol. It's about making sure that the entire system can handle it.
Exactly. And then there's also the issue of vehicle compatibility.
Oh, right, because not all vehicles can run on higher blends of ethanol, right?
Exactly. A lot of the vehicles on Indian roads right now, especially the older models, they might not be designed to run properly on those higher ethanol blends, like that E20 blend.
And if they try to, what could happen?
Well, they could have engine problems, or their performance might take a hit, not run as smoothly.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that's definitely something that needs to be considered.
For sure. The article suggests a couple of things here. For new vehicles, we need to mandate that they're E20 compatible right from the start. Ensure that all those new cars rolling off the assembly lines can handle that higher blend. But for the millions of vehicles that are already out there, that's where things get a little trickier.
Yeah, we can't just force everyone to buy a new car, right?
Nope. So the article suggests offering incentives to encourage people to retrofit their existing vehicles.
So like government programs that help people pay for engine modifications or something like that.
Right. Make it easier and more affordable for people to switch over.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I guess we also need to make sure people understand the benefits of E20. Clear up any misconceptions or concerns they might have.
Absolutely. Public awareness is huge when it comes to these kinds of changes.
Maybe even get the automakers involved,
Yeah.
Partner with them to develop some cost-effective solutions for retrofitting.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, so we've talked about feedstock, we've talked about infrastructure, we've talked about the cars themselves. But what about the financial side of all of this? I mean, the cost of actually producing ethanol must factor into this whole equation, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's a big one.
So what's the situation there?
Well, the prices of those raw materials we use to make ethanol, things like sugarcane and maize, those prices go up and down all the time.
Yeah, they can be pretty volatile.
Exactly. And that makes it hard for the folks who are actually producing ethanol to plan ahead. It creates a lot of uncertainty for them. And right now, a lot depends on those procurement prices set by the government.
And those can change too, right? They can, yeah. Which just adds to the uncertainty.
So it sounds like we need a more stable system if we want people to really invest in ethanol production for the long haul.
Right. Predictability is key. The article actually suggests looking into something called an ethanol price stabilization fund.
Interesting. What would that do?
It would basically act as a kind of safety net for ethanol producers.
Ah, okay.
So when those raw material prices start fluctuating, the fund would be there to cushion the blow, make sure those producers are still getting decent returns even when the market's a bit shaky. And that kind of stability, that's what's going to attract more long-term investment in the industry.
Makes sense. More stability, less risk. That's what investors like to hear.
Exactly. And the article also mentioned moving towards a more market-driven system for ethanol procurement.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow. How would that work?
So they're talking about creating a system that's similar to those renewable energy certificates, the ones used in the power sector. Basically, ethanol producers would earn certificates for the ethanol they produce. And then they could sell those certificates to oil marketing companies
And why would those companies want to buy them?
because they need to meet their blending targets. That whole 20% blending goal we've been talking about. So they'd be buying those certificates to prove that they're using enough ethanol. And that would create a market for ethanol. Producers would be competing, trying to be as efficient as possible. It could really drive innovation in the industry.
Yeah, that's pretty clever.
Yeah.
Could help bring down the cost of producing ethanol too, right? If there's more competition.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we've talked about diversifying what we use to make ethanol. We've talked about decentralizing production, making sure those vehicles are compatible, and stabilizing the financial side of things. But we can't forget about the environmental piece of the puzzle. How do we make sure this push for ethanol doesn't end up hurting the environment?
Yeah, good point. Sustainability is really important here.
Absolutely. And the article definitely emphasizes that. It's not enough to just switch to those water-efficient crops. We need to do more, like encouraging more farmers to adopt drip irrigation. That's one way to save water. And we also need to make sure the distilleries are managing their waste responsibly, not polluting the environment.
Right. It's about making sure the whole ethanol ecosystem is as environmentally friendly as possible, from the crops we grow to the fuel that ends up in our cars.
Right. And that's something that's really important to highlight for the UPSC.
So it sounds like what we're really talking about here is a holistic approach, something that addresses the economic side, the social side, and the environmental side.
Exactly. It's not just about one thing. And this is a great example for you, our aspiring UPSC officers, of how complex these policy decisions can be. You have to consider all these different factors. And the ethanol blending program, it's a great case study, really. It shows those challenges and opportunities that India is facing today. We're trying to grow our economy, but we also want to protect the environment. And we want to make sure everyone benefits.
It is a great case study. And understanding these complexities, that's what's going to help you stand out in those UPSC exams.
For sure.
So as you're studying, remember all this, the challenges, the solutions, the different trade-offs, and think critically. Look for those connections between different policy areas. How does one decision impact another?
Yeah, and don't just stop with this deep dive. Go back to that Business Standard article, dig into those details, think about the arguments they made, and then think about how you would answer questions about this in the mains exam. How would you explain those challenges? What solutions would you propose?
And for those prepping for the prelims, make sure you've got those key facts and figures locked in. Like, what's the current blending target? What are the main feedstocks they're using? Are there any specific government schemes you need to know about? That kind of thing.
Yep. All potential questions for the prelims. But remember, the UPSC, they're not just testing your memory. They want to see that you understand the bigger picture. Can you analyze? Can you connect the dots? That's what's really going to make you shine.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Okay, so we've talked about the challenges. Now let's get to the good stuff, the solutions. How do we actually make this ethanol blending thing work? What does the Business Standard article recommend?
Well, they lay out a pretty detailed roadmap. And they really stress that we need a multi-pronged approach. No silver bullets here.
Okay, multi-pronged approach. Got it. So what's the first prong?
First up, diversifying our feedstock.
Right. Moving away from sugarcane, at least to some extent.
Exactly. We talked about those water concerns, so we need to explore other options like maize and sorghum. Those are much more water efficient.
Okay, makes sense. But wouldn't that require a huge shift in, like, agricultural practices? How do we get farmers on board with that?
That's where those targeted policies and incentives come in.
Right. Got to make it worth their while.
Exactly. The article suggests linking things like the PM Kisan program, the one that gives direct income support to
Mm.
farmers.
Yeah, yeah.
So link that with the adoption of those water efficient crops.
Ah, okay. So, like, give farmers a bonus or higher payments if they grow maize or sorghum specifically for ethanol.
Right. Make it financially attractive for them to make that switch.
Smart. So it's a win-win. Farmers benefit, and we get a more sustainable source of ethanol.
Exactly. Plus, we don't have to rely solely on traditional crops either. The article also talked about using agricultural waste.
Oh, interesting. Like what kind of waste?
Things like, oh, I don't know, stalks and husks and stuff. And damaged food grains, too. Stuff that might otherwise just go to waste.
Right, right. So we're not taking food away from people.
Nope. And it's also a more circular approach, right? We're taking something that would normally be discarded and turning it into valuable fuel.
Very cool. Okay, so that's feedstock. What else did the article recommend?
Well, they talked about decentralizing ethanol production.
Decentralizing. So instead of having like these massive ethanol plants, we'd have smaller ones spread out across the country.
Exactly. And ideally, those smaller plants would be located in rural areas close to where the feedstock is being grown.
Ah, I see. So shorter transportation distances. That helps with the logistics, right?
Yep. Less fuel needed to move things around. And it also creates jobs in those rural areas, closer to where people live.
Right, right. That's a big plus. Could be a real game changer for those communities. The article even suggested linking those distilleries with farmer-producer organizations.
Yes. Imagine those FPOs supplying the feedstock directly to the local distilleries.
Cut out the middleman.
Exactly. And that means better returns for the farmers, too. And the government could help out, too. Offer those low-interest loans through schemes like the Mudra Yojana. Encourage entrepreneurs to set up these small-scale ethanol plants.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've tackled feedstock, we've talked about decentralization. What about those vehicles that might not be ready for E20? What did the article say about that?
Right, so for brand new vehicles, the focus should be on making sure they're E20 compatible right from the start. Mandate it. So every new car that comes off the assembly line is good to go. But then there are all those vehicles that are already on the right. Millions of them.
Yeah, so how do we deal with those? We can't exactly force everyone to buy a new car.
Nope. So the article recommends incentives. Programs that would help people retrofit their existing vehicles.
Okay, so like financial assistance to help cover the cost of those engine modifications.
Exactly. Make it easier for people to make the switch.
And I guess it's also about education, right? Making sure people understand why this is important. Clear up any doubts they might have about E20.
Absolutely. Public awareness is crucial.
Maybe even work with the car companies, Get them involved in developing some affordable retrofitting solutions.
Great idea. Partnering with the industry is key. Okay, so we've covered vehicles. Now, what about the financial uncertainty surrounding ethanol production? Those fluctuating raw material prices. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, that's a big one. I think the article suggested something called an ethanol price stabilization fund.
They did, and that would basically be like a safety net for the ethanol producers.
Ah, okay.
So when those raw material prices start going crazy, the fund would be there to kind of smooth things out, make sure those producers are still making a decent profit, even when the market's all over the place. And that stability, that's what's going to attract those long-term investors. Show them that this is a reliable industry.
Right, because investors don't like risk.
Exactly. The less risk, the better. The article also talked about shifting to a more market-driven system for procuring ethanol.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand that one. How would that work?
It's kind of like what they do in the power sector with those renewable energy certificates.
Ah, okay.
So ethanol producers would earn certificates based on how much ethanol they produce. And then they could sell those certificates to the oil marketing companies, the ones that need to meet those blending targets.
Right, right.
So it creates a market for ethanol. Producers would be competing with each other, trying to be as efficient as possible. And that competition, that could really drive down prices and encourage innovation.
That's a really interesting idea. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about diversifying the feedstock, decentralizing production, making those vehicles compatible, creating financial stability. But what about the environment? How do we make sure this whole push for ethanol doesn't end up backfiring?
That's the key question, right? We can't sacrifice sustainability for the sake of progress. And the article makes that very clear. It's not enough to just switch to those water-efficient crops. We need to go further.
Okay, like what? What else can we do?
Well, we've got to make drip irrigation more widespread. That's huge for water conservation. And then we need to look at how those distilleries are managing their waste, make sure they're not polluting the environment, and encourage them to use renewable energy in their production processes. Make the whole thing as green as possible.
Right, so it's about making the entire ethanol ecosystem more sustainable, from the crops we grow to the fuel that ends up in our cars. It's a big task, but it sounds like it's possible.
It is possible. It just takes careful planning and a commitment to sustainability at every step of the process.
And this is important for everyone, but especially for those UPSC aspirants out there, right?
Oh, absolutely. The UPSC loves to ask about these kinds of complex policy issues. They want to see that you understand the challenges, that you can analyze the solutions, and that you can think critically about the trade-offs involved.
So as you're studying, remember all of this. Think about those interconnections between different policy areas. How does one decision affect another? How do we balance economic growth with environmental sustainability and social equity? These are the big questions the UPSC wants you to grapple with.
And don't forget, this deep dive is just a starting point. Go back to that Business Standard article, dig into those details, look at the data, the arguments, the different perspectives, and think about how you would frame your answers in the mains exam. How would you analyze those challenges? What solutions would you propose?
Yeah, great advice. And for those prepping for the prelims, remember those key facts and figures. What's the current blending target? What are the main feedstocks? What are the relevant government schemes? Those are all potential questions.
Absolutely. But remember, the UPSC isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about understanding the big picture, connecting the dots, and showing that you can think critically.
Well said. And on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive into ethanol blending in India. We hope you found it informative and helpful for your UPSC journey.
If you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to subscribe to our channel and share it with your fellow UPSC aspirants. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a topic that's sure to come up in your exams.
Until then, happy studying and best of luck.